My name is Carl Phillips, and I'm a Senior Director in the Ipsos Corporate Reputation team. And today we're talking about whether trust is in crisis. The widely accepted narrative for most of the past decade is that trust in the major institutions and sectors of the world is in crisis. This narrative is everywhere, amongst politicians and international business leaders, through to academics, PR companies, and business schools. The problem, however, is that evidence for this crisis is far less definitive than most people think. There are not a huge number of trust trends that go back a long way, but we can look at what does exist. This is trust in media and trust in government by the US companies Gallup and Pew. Trust in government fell during the 60s and had peaks and troughs ever since, but for the last decade it's been pretty stable. Media is on a slight downward trajectory. It's jumped a bit over the last decade, but the long-term trend is pretty clear. Looking across the Atlantic at Europe, trust trends from Eurobarometer show a similar story. Trust in political parties and the press have been consistent for most of the last 20 years. Trust in government has fluctuated more, and while it had a recent peak, for example in 2007, it would be hard to describe this trend line to be at crisis levels. Switching back to the US and looking at confidence in big business, which is a good proxy for trust, we do see far more fluctuation over the last 50 or so years. However, again, the story of the last 20 years is pretty consistent. And while this is the first set of data which might indicate that there is a crisis, it's not as though it's new. Ipsos' own data from the Global Trustworthiness Monitor, although only having a few years of trends, is a story of incremental improvement for everyone except the tech sector, which is down slightly. Government and media, to take two sectors often regarded as being in crisis, show little change since 2018. Moving away from sectors and institutions does not change this narrative. Trust in different professions to tell the truth has not substantially changed over the last few years on a global level. Where change is visible, it's amongst doctors and scientists who have improved thanks to their response to COVID. In the UK, we've been tracking trust in professions to tell the truth since the early 80s, and most professions have become slightly more trusted over this time. And while things have improved a bit with government ministers and politicians back in the early 2000s, they're now pretty much back to where they started in 1983. Journalists and business leaders are up a bit over the same time. There are no major changes. There's no visible crisis. Ultimately, trust in some institutions, some organisations and some professions is poor. But in most of those cases, that's been true for a very long time, at least 20 years. Trust hasn't substantially changed recently, but the amount of deference we give authority and the amount of scrutiny that some institutions and some sectors is under has, and that has to be a good thing. Ultimately, there is no evidence that trust is in crisis, and there is no need to panic.